So we're at that part of the quarter where I need to talk about fascism, right? It's not my favorite lecture, but I think it's one of the more important things that we do in the quarter. It used to not be, right? I think my lecture in the past on fascism was probably overly geared towards what you might see on the History Channel, which is a look back at these horrible things that people did in black and white, right? Unfortunately, the subject has become far more relevant than I ever thought it would be during my teaching career. And so I've had to rededicate myself to the subject, the topic, and it's one of the reasons why I assigned the Jason Stanley book, How Fascism Works. Right? So we can think about that as we go through this topic, and I know we've talked about it a little bit already during the quarter. So I guess I can start by maybe talking about the way I used to get into this subject. I think it might be instructive or help you think about it. I actually only did this a couple times because it didn't work at all, or it sort of didn't work the way I expected it to. Back in the day, this is years ago, when I would broach the subject of fascism, since it's something that I think, especially prior to maybe 10 years ago, it wasn't something that we thought had a whole lot of relevance to our lives. I would come in, and this was the way to get into the subject, I would come in and maybe be on purpose a little overtly frustrated that day as I prepared for class. And I would once I started class, I would sort of make a fuss about how frustrated I was with the politics of the day, and that we couldn't get anything done through Congress, and I would sort of work my way towards calling for somebody to do something, right? And maybe it was time. It was so frustrating that we turn power over, at least for a period of time, to somebody who can get us out of this mess. Right? That was where I would end up. And then I would say something like, "Who's with me on that?" Right? And the punchline to that is, welcome to fascism. Right? Turning power over, subverting, try to make it sound as good as possible, subverting democratic norms. Let's just turn power over to someone who's going to solve our problems. That's moving towards what you can now recognize as fascism, given that you've done a lot of reading about it already this quarter. Unfortunately, whenever I would say, in the few times I did this, I would say, "Who's with me?" I'd get some hands. I had done, I guess, too good of a job, bringing people on board with that idea, or I was the instructor, so they felt like I better agree, right? But of course, that was not my goal, and I was a little horrified, when I had to deliver the line, "Welcome to fascism," because for the rest of the class period, that look of betrayal in the eyes of the students who had raised their hands was kind of palpable. And I thought after that, well, what was I really going after? And, really the best solution to, the best response to what I was saying was probably students packing their bags and leaving. Right? That never happened, but then I thought to myself, well, how would I have even brought students back if they did what they should have done, and that is leave the class because someone's here enticing them to fascism, essentially. So I don't do that anymore. But I guess the description helps you kind of, well, hopefully helps you introduce you to the topic, a topic you actually have already, again, you've been reading about in the Stanley book, and maybe you've already seen some of my assigned materials. We're thinking about something that's modern and disturbing. So, yeah, got a couple of quotations that you've already seen here. The one you're looking at now from the well-known Spanish artist Francisco Goya. The sleep of reason brings forth monsters. So that's what we're thinking about, monsters today. At the same time, we're thinking about an ideology, an approach to politics that is often tempting to use to describe your political opponents or our political opponents, right? So that's why I've got also remember Godwin's law up here. Does anybody know what Godwin's law is? It's, well, a law proposed by this guy named Mike Godwin a couple decades ago now, who argued that in the context of social media arguments, in the context of online arguments, wouldn't necessarily be social media back in the day, it'd be more like email when he was thinking about this. But the proposition that the longer an online argument goes and continues, the higher and higher the chances till you reach 100% that somebody brings up the Nazis and typically says their opponent in the argument is acting just like the Nazis, right? And the law was meant to suggest that this was debasing the whole accusation and would essentially end any kind of productive political conversation between the people involved. Once somebody brings out the Nazis and said, you're acting like the Nazis, then kind of the conversation's over, right? Where are you going to go from there? So I think one reason to kind of think about this proposition or law is to remind ourselves that we should be careful with political language. And especially to the degree that I hope we all kind of come to the conclusion that fascism and Nazism are something to be avoided and called out when it's there. We want to sort of keep our powder dry. And we want, as best as we can, to save those kinds of accusations for the moment in which they are warranted. Right? And the more we use accusations like that when they are not warranted, the more those terms and those accusations will be, and those warnings is really what I'm getting at, right? For people like, hey, this is fascism over here, the more they will not be available to us when we need them, right? So I want to acknowledge that going in, and at the same time, I want to open the question of, by the end of this lecture, how concerned should we be about our own political context? How much fascism and maybe even kind of Nazi-esque thinking do you see, politics do you see during our current moment? And I'm afraid my answer is basically too much, right? Political scientist Adolf Reed Jr. recently wrote a warning in regard to this, basically arguing that we seem to be presented with a divided path. In one direction, perhaps a better future, one in which politics is driven in a direction where all of us can find meaningful, purposeful lives and people are treated respectfully no matter what their identity is. The other direction, and the one where the trends seem to point, is some sort of modern fascism, right? This fascism wouldn't necessarily look like that which you see on the History Channel, and I think I started off arguing that, or making the point that when I used to talk about this, I probably sounded more like the History Channel than something fresh and applicable, relevant to the day. And I think still, when we see those black and white videos for the most part, or at least, obviously old videos, they don't seem especially relevant. It almost seems like a cartoon politics compared to modern day, right? Maybe less so than before, but I think the point I would make is that however these politics might end up manifesting themselves in a modern context of today, they will probably be considerably different than the first time around, right? So that's something to keep in mind. Okay. So what are we talking about here? First, I think it's fair to say that fascism and Nazism, and I'll use those interchangeably throughout the lecture, even though I think some distinctions could be made between the two, does represent something that is, I think, relatively new under the sun. And that's not something you can point out very often. That is to say, almost everything that we see in our lives, or experience in our lives, probably experienced by people 100 years ago, 200 years ago, a millennia ago. Right? It's often hard to find something new under the sun, sort of a cliche. But fascism, even though injustice and tyranny in politics is not new, some elements are. And it's thanks to our good old friend from this quarter, industrialization, right? And modern technology. That is to say, modern technology offers would-be tyrannical leaders the opportunity to be more total, more encompassing in their rule, in their control over daily life in their country, more totalitarian in their not just aspiration, but achievement. And that's even more true today than it was for the fascists of 100 years ago, right? Fascists in Italy, fascists in Germany. So because of this technology, fascists are able to achieve some level of control over social life, over cultural life, political life, and economic life in a way that your favorite or least favorite tyrannical king of hundreds or several hundred years ago was able to achieve, right? So that's a way of saying, Henry VIII may have been a horrible person, a horrible monarch, horrible king. The degree to which he could impose his will over the society in which he tyrannized over was very limited compared to what is possible today. And when you think about the modern, more recent technological abilities of governments to spy on their citizens, to collect it all in terms of data, and here I'm quoting the NSA, the leading spy agency in the US government. Their efforts were to collect it all just a few years ago, and who knows what they're trying to do now, but my guess is it's not much different. But the fact that that technology exists means that a fascist government today would have far more power to carry out its will than even the Nazis had at their power almost 100 years ago. But fascism does have a totalitarian aspiration, right? To take control of society in all of these ways. It is also reactionary to most of what we have talked about this quarter. So it's against liberalism. After all, liberalism is about individual rights and liberties, whereas, as we'll see, fascists are about driving people towards almost a worship of the state and nation. Right? Germany above all else. My state, right or wrong, my country, right or wrong, that sort of thinking. So it submerges the individual. So it's anti-liberal. It opposes socialism. Although we will see that socialism plays a unique role in the emergence of historical fascism. We'll see that soon. But socialism proposes, or Marxism proposes, as we've seen, that there are divisions in society between classes. The classes have different interests. Opposing interests often. The owners of capital, the owners of the means of production versus the working class. We've seen that, right? But again, fascism seeks to drive people together in unity as Germans, as Italians, as Americans, right? That's what the heart of nationalism is that sort of spirit. It's against democracy. It's anti-democratic in the sense that people are supposed to have faith in the charismatic leader of the fascist state. Part of the reason why I would come into the classroom trying to introduce the subject in the story that I told at the beginning of all this was to get students to understand that frustrations about the muddiness of democracy often provide an in or an opportunity for fascists to offer a way out of that muddiness and that frustration. And clearly in American society today, there are people who are just absolutely frustrated with the democratic process, that not the party, but the process of democracy, that we seem unable to solve basic problems. Fascists propose, let's hand power to somebody who will solve those problems. So it's against that aspect of something we've talked about, that of democracy, something we proposed as an ideal early in the quarter. It is anti-egalitarian, so equality is antithetical to fascism. As we'll see, and as you've read in the Stanley book, fascism proposes that there are static hierarchies in society. So some people are better than others. Clearly at the top would be that charismatic leader. But some fascists propose that some races are better than others. Some nations are better than others. And that those hierarchies should rule the day. We should not think in liberal terms of equality. And in some ways, fascism is against the very Enlightenment project that is kind of in the background of much of what we've talked about in this class. What is the Enlightenment project? Well, at its heart, it's the idea that human beings are rational, that evidence and reason matter, that that's how we should organize society around those kinds of ideals. Fascists would like to say that a lot of that has taken away the animal spirits of humanity that have driven us to be great in the past. That we shouldn't have so much faith in a dead hand of rationality, but instead we should be in touch with our animalistic side of being, right? So in some ways, in many ways, deeply antagonistic to the Enlightenment project. So how might we apply the triadic model that we've tried to apply to all of the to each of the ideologies we've considered this quarter. Well, let's have a stab at it. We can say that the agent, or for fascists, the hero of the story is the nation state above all. Nation being the focal point of that. The nation, when you talk about nations versus states, nations, you're talking about a culture. You're talking about oftentimes ethnic or racial homogeneity. You're talking about a people. Right? So when you start to understand that aspect of nation, then it's not so far a stretch to suddenly realize why the Nazis talked in terms of Aryan superiority, right? And then the state would be that set of institutions that would carry out the will of the nation, right? So the hero is the nation state above all. And the goal is national power and glory. Everyone should be organized and focused on that, not your own individual needs and interests, but the needs and glory of the nation of which you are a part. And then obstacles to this, as we've introduced every time we consider the triadic model, the thing that complicates the story are the obstacles that face the hero and its goals, right? So in this case, the things that I identified earlier, Enlightenment ideas, especially liberal notions about individuals having rights against the state, and Marxist notions about divisive class struggle. I'll probably say this more than once, but I said that socialism has a special relationship to fascism, and Marxism, a special relationship to fascism, not because they are fascist, right? So make a clear distinction here. Marxism and socialism, yes, we talked about how the 20th century presided over the rise of some totalitarian communist states, but that's not what I'm getting at here. What I'm getting at is a relationship that has tended to be the avenue through which fascism rises. And that is a rising leftist threat to the status quo, right? The perception that the status quo is being threatened by a left-wing ideology, by workers' movements, that sort of thing has in the past led conservatives, who are not fascists, but conservatives, to look to fascists as a way of combating this rising leftist threat to the status quo. So do you understand what I'm getting at there? Yeah, Isaiah.
Doesn't fascism also seek to destroy right-wing ideologies like libertarianism?
Does fascism seek to destroy right-wing ideologies like libertarianism? I guess if we're using the term right-wing to describe libertarianism, then the answer has to be yes to that. But I think libertarians, in the sense that they are capitalists and that they are the owners of the means of production, so not your average libertarian off in college somewhere that doesn't have anything but still thinks it's a good idea. That set of people, the capitalists, end up historically empowering fascists at that moment when they feel like the threat from the left is something they need to control, right? So conservatives in Germany turned power over to Hitler, thinking, first of all, they could control him. They couldn't. But also because they thought he would help solve their socialism problem, which they saw as a much bigger threat than the Nazis, who to many, they kind of looked like cartoon characters of a sort, right? They were brutes, they were violent, but they were necessary in order to combat the rising left. So does that help you understand it a bit?
Kind of.
Right, yeah. Arlo?
I was just gonna say, like, if Marxism is like an extreme left thing, is fascism an extreme right thing?
Yes,
Do they
yeah.
go?
Yeah, fascism should be seen as a politics of the right wing. And I know some people have disagreed with that in the past, but when you look at what provokes fascism and its relationship to a rising left, it's hard to see it as anything but that, right? I think what confuses things is that in the 20th century, at the same time, there's totalitarianism on the right and there's totalitarianism on the left, right? But they're not the same thing. Yeah.
I think it's kind of hard to compare them because I think like on the right, like far right and far left, like I guess like far left, like I don't even think like people could argue like China like right now or North Korea, but I think like on the far right it's kind of like historically like really a lot worse than like the left. Like I don't know, I feel like it's kind of weird to compare them. Like
Yeah. I'm sympathetic to this, right? Sympathetic to this. The way I've thought about it is this. I spent a lot of time kind of redeeming socialism the last few lectures, right? I don't think this can be redeemed at all. I think that the goals of socialists can be argued about, but it really is an idealistic, in a good way, attempt at trying to deal with the reality of industrial capitalism and its pathologies. So the goals of socialists are very different from what fascism is all about, which is, again, reiterating and reestablishing ancient hierarchies of inequality that are basically irrational, men over women, racial hierarchy, that sort of thing. And that's sort of the point. Politics of us and them. And to use the state as a vehicle to glorify and empower that kind of politics. So it's hard to find anything good about that unless you just want to say in a vacuum that unity is good. But that's not where we live, in a vacuum. And the unity that we're talking about is only a slice of the population, not the whole, and certainly not the world, right? I think it's helpful to think of fascism as a political fever, right? And it helps us make a distinction that I think is worth making. And that is the difference between a fascistic state and kind of run-of-the-mill authoritarian government. I wouldn't want to live in either one, right? An authoritarian state, though, we think of maybe as kind of more gray than anything else. Like life has sort of been sapped out of that setting. If there is an authoritarian leader just kind of with a kind of a lazy, dead hand, nevertheless, with a military, something like that, that is oppressing, or a government that's oppressing the people or maintaining an illiberal status quo, versus politics at a fever pitch, right? One in which the people are excited, provoked to be excited about the regime and its practices, to the point where you're producing an unthinking mob of sentiment, of excitement, that is driven by nationalism. Again, maybe think in terms of nationalism versus patriotism. Patriotism being a positive thing, nationalism being a negative thing. Some writers don't make quite that distinction, but I think that's helpful. Nationalism being much more reflective of the sentiment that I mentioned earlier, my country, right or wrong. Doesn't mean that anybody who says that is a fascist, but it's headed in that direction. It leaves, for example, someone without the tools to, say, criticize the American invasion in Iraq. It leaves you without the tools, unless you just want to say it's a military mistake, but it doesn't allow you to criticize it morally. It leaves one without the tools to criticize Vietnam War. And by now we've added up 4 or 5 million people dead, right? And it leaves you without an ability to criticize your country's behavior in those wars, et cetera. So it's driven by nationalism, my country, right or wrong, versus patriotism. Let me finish the thought, which would not be headed down the same pathological path. Patriotism would be driven by love of country, but that love would be an adult love, one that required a patriot to criticize one's country when it was failing to live up to its ideals. So you see the distinction there. Fascism doesn't have it within itself to do that. Right. Usually, and the way fascism is typically framed, it's hard to imagine a fascistic regime without devotion to a strong or charismatic leader. Right, so you need a figurehead that excites the people. Now, obviously, Mussolini and Hitler come to mind. And then in relation to the notion of political fever, there is the attempt, and to the degree that it's a truly fascistic regime, like it's coming to fruition, a successful effort by a regime to generate an ecstatic sense amongst the population, an overwhelming spirit of connection. What does that mean, right? My best attempt at helping students understand what the ecstatic sense would feel like if you've ever had a strong religious sense or experience. If you've ever, let's put it in kind of everyday terms. If you've gone to a concert at a stadium and the band comes out and you kind of feel a shiver, the ecstatic sense would almost feel like an out-of-body moment. If you've gone to see a football game, similar experience, that kind of thing. So it's not necessarily pernicious at all, right? Human beings have ecstatic feelings and sensibilities at certain moments in our lives. Point here is that it's being provoked and to some degree harnessed by a political regime. Yeah.
I was just going to say, isn't it sort of similar to everybody wearing their football jerseys on a Sunday and just feeling a part of something in that way?
Yeah, I mean, it's I guess really fervent adherence or fandom of a sports team could be comparable to this. That's not to say that allowing yourself that sensibility means you're acting in a fascistic way, but you could kind of, if you love the Seahawks or whatever, one of the teams that played Sunday or something like that, you can kind of use that as a way of understanding this sort of devotion that a fascist regime is attempting to provoke amongst its citizenry, right? So we should think about maybe when we're asked to be devoted to our country, to what end, and whether or not the sense of devotion or even ecstasy, that ecstatic sense, is towards a healthy love of country or maybe an unthinking devotion to it. Yeah, there was a question.
Yeah, so would you consider current China to be a fascist regime?
Um,
I know that they call themselves communist, but
yeah, I would not. I think maybe North Korea would be kind kind of, you see the politics involved there, and I know they're on the political left in terms of at least their proclamations. So it's sort of a, inconsistency that I would mention North Korea. But I'm thinking of sort of the devotion to country and that sort of, the heroic leader and that sort of thing. If we want to use that as a kind of a stand-in, we can do that. I don't think there's a hard and fast rule, right? So you might ask, well, would Vladimir Putin represent a fascistic leader? And I think a case obviously could be made. I don't know that German or Russian society is as focused in support of the regime as that. The war is a way that leaders do tend to try to achieve that sort of thing, but it's got to be a successful war, right? Yeah.
So what makes China not fascist?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know that I would call China fascist. It doesn't seem to have the sort of political fever that I've been describing. And there's plenty of attempted dissent in China, right? And I guess part of me just doesn't want to go along with what the U.S. government wants to say about China, right? I think a lot of what we're hearing today about those horribly frightening balloons are an attempt to kind of gin up support for the national security state in our own country. And I think it's a very dangerous thing that we should kind of drag our feet towards. But I mean, you could make the case, I think, but I don't see it as on par with Italy in the 1920s and 30s or Germany in the 30s and 40s. Yeah.
So, even though like China is mostly totalitarian, like there's lots of surveillance, it's a lot of the government filtering like what people see and all that, and it's kind of like a surveillance state, and it's definitely like kind of totalitarian.
Yeah.
It has a lot of characteristics of fascism, but what makes it not fascistic is, what makes it not fascistic is the fact that the people aren't in full support of that.
Yeah. Well, I think you can have an authoritarian state and an ugly totalitarian, aspirationally totalitarian state without it being fascistic, I think would be the distinction. If talking about China and aspects of its governmental policy or nation, if talking about that as in terms of fascism helps you constructively make a point, then I think you should use the word, right? But I don't think we should get overly hung up about defining, well, which slate of countries are fascistic and which are not. We should be more, I think, aware of the kind of politics that we're talking about, right? Yeah.
I think two things. I think that like arguing China as a surveillance state, I think you have to kind of include like America in that. I think there's a lot of arguments that, I mean, it's definitely a police state, but I think there also are a lot of arguments for being a surveillance state as well.
Yeah.
I think the thing about like China and North Korea is that there's not very many like non-state, like United States funded research on it. Like a lot of like news articles and like
Yeah.
things on like North Korea are typically always funded by, I mean, Western media and like those like victims of communism type organizations. So I think it's kind of like hard to like put a complete label on it because there's not really a lot of like solid proof of anything going on. Like I mean like all those like clickbaity articles come like once a month where it's like Kim Jong-un like kills anyone who doesn't mourn his dad or something. They're like kind of really obviously like, you know, fake.
Yeah.
And so I think it's kind of
I think it's fair to say those are hardly states any of us would want to live in, right? And that they're authoritarian and tyrannical. Without getting derailed too much on talking about those specific countries in the context of this lecture, though, I guess maybe one thing I would add is that there's a history to also apply and understand in the context of those regimes rising up, right? As I've made the point, I think once or twice this quarter, for example, North Korea, however, whatever we might say about that regime, and we'd say a lot, I think we know a lot, even though it's a closed society and it's hard to know as much as we would want to know. It is the product of, in part, the Korean War, where the United States basically destroyed every single city in the country, right? Leveled the country, not just in the north either, right? So that kind of stuff has consequences. That's not to place the blame entirely on the United States, but it means there's some there, considerable amount too, I would say, yeah.
I was just going to say, I mean, would you say that maybe, I'm just going to throw something at the wall.
That's fair.
Would you say that maybe you could describe China as having a fascistic-like government, but the nation itself isn't inherently fascist because it doesn't have the support of its people? Sort of, it's very extremely authoritarian, but it does not produce outward action.
Yeah. Authoritarian, I think one thing missing from China being kind of thought of as an outright fascistic state, there are some exceptions to this, but by and large it doesn't seek to expand or start wars on its border. It's, you can think of Tibet, you can think of the state of the island off of China, Taiwan, yeah. But it's not as expansionist as you would think if you were going to call it a fascistic state and trying to whip up war to unify the citizenry. Because what you've said is, it's a authoritarian government, but maybe the society itself doesn't support all of that. But when we talk about fascism, we are talking about all of that sort of working in synchronicity. So part of what fascism involves the people going along with it and being able to be whipped up into the fervor, the political fever that I've been talking about. Taylor.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on to all that, the information that we receive about things. There is so much propaganda everywhere, and people think oh, propaganda is that's only in North Korea and that's only in Nazi Germany. And it's that in and of itself is propaganda that we
Yeah.
There's so much information you don't even realize is
Yeah.
propaganda, but it is.
Yeah, I guess I would say whatever China is, whatever North Korea is, I can't really do much about that, but I can focus on my own state, my own government, and make sure that it lives up to the ideals that I think are important. And that seems to be the thing in front of me. Let's make sure that my government doesn't go kill a bunch of people like it does. Another aspect of fascism is an obsessive call to rejuvenate a decadent society. So there's this argument or propaganda or kind of the line is that we're a decadent society in need of rejuvenation, return to ancient ideals, that sort of thing. Usually the ancient ideals are kind of invented in the sense that they never actually fully held sway. So there's the sense of an imagined ideal past that we need to get back to, and instead we're part of a decadent society that it's lost its way. Typically also in a fascistic context, there's an obsessive preoccupation with same kind of thing, community decline, humiliation by countries around the world, right? We're the laughing stock of the world, that sort of thing, or we're somehow victims of the world, right? And violence as an ideal, right? So the more that's held up, especially in the political realm, as something we should admire, people who are willing to be violent. These are aspects that are evidence that a country is driving towards fascism. Right. I have this picture, one of the Nuremberg rallies that the Nazis held in the 1930s, sort of in connection to the point I was making about the ecstatic sensibility that is being provoked. So the Nazis held these rallies in large part to give people that sense they were part of something bigger, much bigger than themselves, and to provoke that ecstatic sense. It's hard to continue to do that, though, right? People aren't naturally kind of in that mode about their country. Maybe some people are, but most people aren't. So there's an older book about fascism called Robert Paxton's Anatomy of Fascism. And in it, he has the 5 stages of fascism. And I want to go through that. But to the point I was just making, the last part of it is and maybe this will help us understand some of the countries around the world that we were talking about a few moments ago. There are moments where the regime either is able to continue to radicalize the population, or it sinks into kind of an entropy. And that's when a fascist regime will kind of think of it as a burned out star. It might still be it's authoritarian, but it's kind of recedes back into maybe a gray kind of, your average depressing authoritarian regime. So how does a country continue to radicalize itself? I mean, those rallies will only work for a period of time, won't they? Right? Eventually you have to go win a game, right? If you're going to make a sports analogy. So war is defining enemies from the outside. In Nazi Germany, notorious for defining enemies within. But at some point, you're going to have to look outwards. And war is that moment. If you're able to provoke war and victory, that's when you see the fascist regime fully kind of flower, I think, and able to maintain its kind of hold over the population. But going back, here are some of the 5 stages of fascism that Paxton identified. The first one is he labels intellectual exploration, and that's something that you see in every society. People that are disillusioned with democracy and crying about a loss of national vigor, that sort of thing. Probably every society has that, seed within it. The question is whether that seed will grow. In that regard, the second stage is rooting the fascist movement, aided by political deadlock or polarization, a breakdown in politics, in other words, becomes a player on the national stage. So if we are to start edging towards asking whether the Trump administration was an example of an attempt at fascism or was indeed fascism, we can at very least, no matter how you answer that, and Jason Stanley has an answer, we can at least say that Trump and other right-wingers in the United States exploit political deadlock and the inability to do policy that makes most of the population happy. People can decide to go to the left to answer those questions and try to change the status quo, or they can go to the right. So that's the question here. And then arrival to power, the third factor, or the third stage. And this is what I mentioned earlier. Conservatives seeking to control rising leftist opposition invite the movement to share power. And this is most obviously what happened in Germany, where in 1933, Hitler is appointed chancellor, and in a short amount of time, he's actually able to consolidate power. So exercise power, that's number 4. The movement and its charismatic leader control the state in balance with state institutions such as police and traditional elites such as clergy and business magnates. Right. So those on top already tend to keep their position. And again, this kind of connects with their desire to, if they've got to choose radicals, they'll choose the radicals on the right because they will preserve the status quo, and they certainly won't upend it as leftists and threats from the left promise to do. Right. And then we talked about radicalization or entropy. Right. So, Nazism in particular, I want to talk about that. We've been saying some things about it already, but Nazism emerges in the heart of Western civilization, and I think that's an important point to kind of consider, think about. Because up to that time, and indeed past that time, to this day, those of us who live in so-called Western civilization are encouraged to believe that Western civilization is superior to all others. That's where modernism comes from. That's where all the things that we like come from. And yet, in Germany, the country that could have been given as the example of all examples of the height of Western civilization, this turn to barbarism arises. So it should provoke some humility amongst those who would be tempted to point to Western civilization as the fountain of superior culture, especially given the dire consequences of the rise of Nazism in Germany. If we just think about World War II, there are at least 55, that number changes from time to time, it's hard to pin it down, but more than 55 million people dead. More than 6 million Jews and millions of others systematically exterminated in what we can describe as industrialized murder, right? And millions more beyond these numbers, their lives are shattered. And I would count my own grandfather on my dad's side as an example of this, who was not in World War II in terms of direct fighting or anything like that, but he was the highest ranking civilian officer at McClellan Airfield in Sacramento, where I'm told all of the planes that went to the Pacific Theater, he was in charge of that operation, basically. And, you know, who knows what to say about the personal stories that you hear when you're growing up, but the story was that the stress of that experience and of the war led to his alcoholism, right? And he died at a much earlier age than he otherwise would have, right, had that not occurred. So that's one of millions of stories that could be told by families all over the world as a consequence of World War II, which was, of course, itself a consequence of the rise of fascism. So we should think of more than even the astounding numbers of deaths as part of the story, as part of the consequence of allowing politics to go off just the deep end, right? And I would say one more thing about this with regard to Nazism and Western civilization. I said that fascism was something new under the sun. Put this up here so you can take a look at it. But fascism is something new under the sun, but that wasn't quite right. And for this reason, yes, the industrialization of it all, I think you can point to that especially as something that could really only happen in the after industrialization happens. But by the time Nazism rose in the 30s, colonialism had been going on for hundreds of years, leading some analysts to argue that fascism was merely colonialism and imperialism brought back home. So the kinds of murder and tyranny and injustice that was perpetrated in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, by imperial powers, not just Germany, looks pretty similar in comparison. I think there are some distinctions that can be made, and that sometimes are made, but not enough to dismiss this argument that European fascism was colonialism, imperialism, brought back home and applied to European citizens. And at root of all this is a crisis politics that I don't know if I've said this specifically at this quarter, but people tend to make really bad decisions when they are desperate. So we can understand that, if not just dismiss the politics that people subscribe to in Nazi Germany. So the Great Depression is probably the most important historical event other than World War I, leading to fascism in Europe. And especially during economic bad times, people do make horrible decisions. And we have made our own sets of horrible decisions, and we can see economic crisis in the background of those as well. Now, one thing I would want to pick out of this list here under crisis politics and the descent into barbarism, and that would have to do with the line midway through where it says Hitler appointed chancellor and consolidates power. I kind of went over that quickly. Consolidates power, meaning he wasn't a dictator when he was first appointed chancellor, but he was able to achieve that in a very relatively short amount of time. A key moment that allowed a maybe someone who maybe wouldn't have been nearly as consequential to achieve the sort of concentrated power that Hitler achieved was a fire, arson, that burned down the German parliament just a short time after Hitler was appointed chancellor. So the Reichstag, which is the equivalent of our Capitol building, is burned. And it's a mystery as to who does it. But Hitler doesn't let a crisis go to waste, and he immediately blames communists for doing that and invokes what under the Weimar Constitution was an enabling act, which gave the leader at the moment dictatorial power in the case of a national emergency. So I think this is an important moment involving the consolidation of power by Hitler, among others. But I think this sort of moment is important to consider and to watch out for in your own life, in your own country, right? And beware of potential Reichstag moments of crisis where the people are off kilter and they're suddenly concerned about national security, that sort of thing, and those who would seek to attain more power exploit that moment to get it. So you might refer to that as a potential Reichstag moment, if that makes sense. Questions about any of this? Yeah.
Isn't that exactly where the sort of connection or development from a communist or socialist nation becomes a fascist regime? Isn't it from that moment of a Reichstag moment?
Yeah.
Power?
I think this is not something that is just applicable to fascism, if I can answer what I think you're saying. Anyone in authority who wants more of it, more power, will be tempted to use a moment of crisis to achieve more. It's kind of basic Machiavellian politics, right? Rahm Emanuel at the start of the Obama administration made a similar comment about never letting a crisis go to waste. The Great Recession, in order to achieve policies that you would otherwise not be able to do. So this isn't, strictly speaking, something that only fascists do. It's a matter of opportunism power meets opportunity, right? Obviously, in a nascently fascistic moment, it is particularly dangerous, right? Imagine if 9/11 had happened in December 2020. After the election, Trump's still in power. Terrorists hit the Freedom Tower now, or something like that. That's a moment waiting to be exploited. That sort of thing, right? So that's what I'm getting at when I think about of a Reichstag moment, an opportunity for someone in power to exploit it and gain even more. Yeah.
Why were the Nazis called National Socialists?
Well, that's their own name, and that's probably something I should go into next time. Again, they're trying to co-opt a working class and trying to attract them away from other left-wing competitive parties and movements. So National Socialism is a political, incorporation of the term socialism is a political move, trying to bring people over to their side. Yeah. All right, let's leave off there, and we'll continue this on Thursday.